you, Kathy. This is an interesting audience. I see we're almost exclusively female, pretty much, which is an observation that I'll make, and we can think about that. I pulled these observations together, as Kathy generously put it, realizing on Wednesday I was going to speak today. They are thoughts that I've had about the foundational aspects of today's modern rape culture in the past that we can see, and in the experiences of survivors of sexual violence in the past. And I would just like to say that I really encourage and enjoy an interactive type of podium experience. I think it's way better for you, and quite frankly, it's awesomely better for me if people participate, if they ask questions, if they engage. If I say something, that just doesn't seem quite clear, I would love to see a hand go up, or just interrupt me, okay? I'm really, really good with interruptions, all right? Okay. So I want to talk today, and I got to say one more thing. I wasn't sure what the introductory thing would be, so I'm spending less time than I might, actually, on the evidence of the past, and a little bit more time actually articulating some of the aspects of rape culture. It's a horrible phrase, right? And it's a horrible thing to have to live with. And we think we know what it is. But sometimes it's very, very helpful to make a list of all the things that it can and does include. And so I'm going to conclude with one of those lists, which I've quoted from a feminist blogger, and link that back, or we'll see how it links back to the kind of foundational period of rape culture that I will briefly talk about. Okay? Okay. So as I said, I want to talk about the foundations of rape culture. I want to talk about the foundations of rape culture right here in Canada, during the same week that our news is filled with the accounts of a judge, a Canadian judge, who asked the survivor of a sexual assault, "Why didn't you just keep your knees together? Why didn't you just put your bottom into the sink so he couldn't penetrate you?" And then he told her, pain and sex sometimes go together. So we can link these right here, right now, where we're standing, to the past that also cohered here in the period I'm going to talk about. Where we are standing is a colonialist space. It's hopefully also and increasingly a post-colonialist space, right? Where we work against those legacies of colonialism. And it has become customary, for example, and as Dean Peers noted, to log the fact that we are standing on First Nations land. We can also think about the word colony and colonization in a different sense, and we can think about this space when it was a colony and situate sexual violence within it. And similarly, acknowledge or try to acknowledge the legacy of those times upon the lives today of survivors of sexual violence, on survivors and targets of sexual harassment, on the survivors of sexual assaults. Where we are standing, or where some of you are standing, was a colony, was in the late 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. So round about the 1780s to the 1850s-ish, okay? So we're talking 150 to 250 years ago. This place was called Upper Canada, not Ontario. It was a British colony, and it was right next door to the really, really brand new United States of America, who had just created their nation. The American Revolution had just happened then. The French Revolution was in progress. And each of these revolutions was about fundamental values, right? Can you think of some of the values that those revolutions were about? One that's still big for us now. Any ideas? Yeah. Freedom, for sure. What other things? Yeah. Nationalism. Yep. What about relationships between people? Starts with an E. Yeah. Equality. Absolutely. These were about equality as a fundamental value. But it didn't mean the same thing that it means to us. It meant equality among white men with property. So it included whole swaths of the population, right? On racialized grounds or gendered grounds or classed grounds. So right here where we are standing, black people lived in slavery. Right here where we are standing, and the reason that we can, is that First Nations were dispossessed. Right here where we are standing in this era, it was illegal for a woman to own her own property. Right here, it was illegal for a woman to vote. It was illegal for her to obtain what you are doing, a professional education. It was illegal for women to control their bodies in terms of reproduction and in terms of consent after marriage. Once married, you no longer had the right to withdraw consent from your husband. Though today we acknowledge that sexual violence happens against cis or gay or bi or questioning men, in the time period that we are talking about, sexual violence only happened to women, and it was only committed by men. And I want to clarify, I'm talking about the construct of the time. I'm not talking about reality. I'm not saying no man was sexually assaulted. I'm saying in the construct of sexual violence in this colonial era, it could only be committed by men upon women. So without a penis and a vagina in the equation, British colonial peoples, under the rule of British law, had no category for what we see as multiple forms of sexual assault. They had buggery, they had sodomy, they had bestiality, but that's really a different discourse that we're leaving aside today. So they only had rape, and it could only happen when a male body violated a female body. This is the legal definition of rape, where we are standing in the colonial era. Rape is a felony punishable by death. It signifies the carnal knowledge of a woman forcibly and against her will. Legal texts for judges, like the books that judges read, explain this a lot more fully. Listen to this one, and you might want to think about this one says. That, quote, because rape is an accusation easy to be made and hard to be proved and harder to be defended by the party accused, though ever so innocent. What does that quote mean? Do you want me to read it again? Because rape is an accusation easy to be made and hard to be proved and harder to be defended by the party accused, though ever so innocent. Think about that as I go through some more of the discussion of rape and the survivors. So because of this concept of rape as something that is pretty easy to say happened to you and pretty hard to defend yourself against, special gendered rules of evidence surrounded survivors of rape and sexual assault. To credibly complain of rape or sexual harm, a woman must be of good fame. What does that phrase mean, of good fame? Does it mean she's famous? No, what do you think it means? Pardon? She's from a good family, exactly. She has a good reputation. What does a good reputation for women mean? You know what it means, right? It means you're not sleeping around, right? To credibly complain of sexual harm, listen to this. This is all in this law. She must when she presently discovered the offense, make pursuit after the offender. What does that mean? That means right now, when this has just happened, she has to run after her offender. It doesn't say what she's supposed to do next if she catches up to him, but that's what she's supposed to do. She must also, quote, show circumstances and signs of injury. But, quote, if she concealed her injury, and by this they mean the instance of the rape, if she concealed her injury for any length of time, then there is, quote, a strong presumption that her testimony is false. A woman, by the way, under this statute could be as young as 10 years old, and it was questionable 12 and under. So what do we have? What do we have built into the law and its administration by the courts of British justice in this colony? We have, number one, a presumption of male innocence. We have, number two, a presumption that women falsely accuse. We have a concern with harm to innocent men, with male fates and male futures. Does this resonate with any cases we've heard recently? There's a focus on the good reputation of the survivor, that she must be of good fame. These days, that means she shouldn't have been drinking too much. These days, that means she shouldn't sleep around. Then, it actually meant pretty much the same thing, with the additional caveat that for a single woman, she should be a virgin, and for a married woman, she should be chaste, that is, faithful to her husband. So there is a focus, too, under this law, on deciding just exactly and precisely a survivor of rape should behave. Is she allowed to be fearful of her attacker in the immediate aftermath of the assault? Is she allowed to reel in pain or to seek comfort and safety? Is she allowed to cope with the terror of the moment? No. She's supposed to get up and run after him and raise the alarm. She has to overcome the harm done to her psychically and physically and go get him. Anything short of this exact prescribed description of the appropriate behavior for a recently raped woman in deep trauma, and the assault wasn't real. It wasn't rape. It didn't happen. So can we see the foundations in this legal construction of rape that defined it, that characterized its survivors, and feared for its perpetrators in the rape culture of today? I think we can. I think it echoes loud and clear in the rape culture of today. Can we hear the echoes of, why didn't you keep your knees together? Why didn't you put your bottom in the sink? Or what did you expect if you got drunk and passed out? Can we hear the echoes of that? Absolutely we can. And as I expected to have a hangover, one survivor has recently and famously written, not to have to survive rape. We know there were at least 104 violent sexual assaults that reached some portion of the judicial process right here where we are standing in the colony of Upper Canada. Of these, 50 men were charged with rape. 54 of these men were found guilty. 40 men were charged with attempted rape, and of these, 60% were found guilty. Sometimes men were charged with attempted rape instead of rape because it was more straightforward to prove, because there did not have to be evidence of penetration to prove attempted rape. Also, juries were much more willing to convict because the death penalty was off the table. Most successful prosecutions involved women we would call children, that is 10 years of age and under. Most included evidence of severe physical injury or were instances of gang rape. Still, it is a high rate of conviction, despite the enormous barriers placed in the way of prosecution. The absence of a police, there was no police to go to in this era. The sheer geography of access to the law in the context of a frontier society without very many roads, without cars, where people moved at the speed they could walk or ride a horse. In other words, 3 to 4 miles an hour, typically. And this high rate of conviction is actually explicable by the fact that only a case able to meet these almost impossible standards of behavior and circumstance and evidence ever made it into the judicial process in the first place. Some women behaved the way they were supposed to by statute. For example, Hannah Smith was raped in 1797. Her rapist threatened to kill her if she told anyone, but she did tell. She walked immediately to the local magistrates, a walk of some miles over frontier roads, and laid a complaint. She explained and described her assault to a room full of only men, deciding on whether she was raped or not. And she graphically told how she'd been attacked while on an everyday errand and, quote, carried to a rogering place in the thick woods and was very much hurt and abused. Like Smith, the vast majority of women in the records that we have encountered their assailants in the public spaces of the colony. And it's interesting, and contrary to our perception, I think, of rape, that in these records, rape was an overwhelmingly rural crime. We have only 2 instances of prosecutions in this early era in a quote-unquote urban setting. Not that there were really cities, but there were things sort of like towns, right, where people lived. Vashti Waterhouse, for example, went to pick strawberries to preserve for her family in 1831, and she was raped by John Standish, quote, on the plains near Brantford. Berry picking was actually an incredibly dangerous activity for women in isolated, predictable locales, often alone. Like Hannah Smith and other survivors whose names we know these names, for example, Helen Gunn, Bridget Stokes, Jane Edgar, Mrs. Scott, Jane Lambert, Mary Ann Bullock. Like them, Vashti Waterhouse's rapist was successfully prosecuted. They were the quote-unquote perfect victims. Virgins or chaste married women or very, very young, of good fame. They could demonstrate consistent, prolonged resistance. Their bodies showed signs of physical injury, often severe. They sought the justice system immediately after the rape. And they had what we would call, they didn't know this word, what we would call the psychological strength and toughness to say things to all male juries, filled with all male supporters in all male courtrooms, while supporters of the defendant, of the accused, hissed and jeered in the public space of the courtroom. They had to say things like, "He had done what he wanted before he let me go," or "He remained in me till he was satisfied," or that he, quote, "effected his purpose." Only these rapes met the colonial construction of this crime. And they could make everyone see, even a courtroom full of men adjudicating a law written by men, why they couldn't have kept their knees together or got their bottom into the sink. They could make these men understand that. They could prove they had not consented. This was the rape culture of their era. I think it laid the foundations for at least multiple aspects of rape culture today. To quote the feminist blogger Melissa McEwen, and this is from a lengthy, lengthy blog defining rape culture, it laid the foundation for Rape culture is treating straight sexuality as the norm. Rape culture is victim blaming. Rape culture is the idea that only certain people get raped. Rape culture is the assertion that wives can't be raped. Rape culture is the contention that only nice girls can be raped. Rape culture is a belief that women cannot withdraw consent once sexual activity commences. Rape culture is a pervasive imagery of stranger rape. Rape culture is the belief that there is a typical way to behave after rape. And finally, rape culture is the refusal to acknowledge that the only thing a person can do to avoid being raped is never to happen to have the bad luck to be in the same space as a rapist. Thank you.